Hello and welcome to this recording of a talk that I delivered at the British Lichen Society AGM in Carlisle at the weekend, and it's for those of you who can attend. So once again, welcome. The talk I'm going to give is titled "The Living Palace Lichens at Blenheim," and my name is Dr. Nicholas Carter. I'm a lecturer and researcher at the University of Oxford, and we have developed a relationship with Blenheim, a research relationship, and it's that I'm going to be talking about in relation to the lichens at the palace. So, a little bit more about the relationship here, as you can see from the slides there. If you didn't know what Blenheim Palace looked like, there it is in the top left corner. And the palace invited us to start a conversation with them with regards to a restoration project they have started. And they were very interested in developing a research relationship with the university. And they had a number of questions about the stonework. And essentially, the restoration project is going to be taking place potentially over the next 10 to 20 years. So it's going to be an extensive project. And depending on how kind of things go and depending on kind of how that research develops, we will kind of see how long the research relationship lasts. Currently, we're around about kind of just over halfway through the current kind of phase of restoration. And the part of the research relationship I'm going to talk to you about today, as I mentioned, is about the lichens at the palace. So when the palace first got in touch with us, they were very interested in kind of what the lichens were doing there on the palace walls, because they'd seen them, and as part of the kind of the whole restoration side of things, they were a little bit concerned at first about what they might be doing in terms of the stonework, and wanted a little bit more information about what they were, and kind of what, potentially kind of whether they were going to be a problem long term for them, and had been a problem. So I was invited over, and the first thing I actually did was that I took a little stroll round the site. So as I was walking around, I could very much see that, yep, lichens were certainly present there. Going from the outside wall through to kind of looking at the windowsills, the kind of various architectural features of the palace, even the stone kind of chairs at the back, the stone bench seats. I even got the opportunity to go up the scaffolding that was there as the restoration started to take a look at some of the lichens higher up on the building. And so I could kind of get a kind of initial feel for what sort of lichens were there and kind of get a sense of the site. So they were absolutely right. They did have lichens at the palace. And so really, what I wanted to be able to do was kind of give them some insight into how these lichens were behaving, and also kind of where they were, and so kind of what they were sort of contributing to this whole process in terms of the restoration that's currently taking place there. So I thought a good place to start would be by kind of explaining kind of what lichens were, but not necessarily through science straight away. So I started off with poetry, and I kind of told them that lichens have been something which have been very much in the consciousness in cultural terms, in terms of artists and poets. And I started off with this wonderful poem by Elizabeth Bishop, which talks about lichens being the still explosions on the rocks, and which I think is a wonderful description, one of the best descriptions I've ever heard about stone lichens, and shared this with them. And so just to kind of get a kind of feeling here that there's something more to lichens than just the science, and hopefully eventually get them to see that there's something more to lichens than maybe what they've heard already, in terms of kind of their relationship with stonework, especially. So yeah, started with Elizabeth Bishop. I actually then kind of went on to tell them a few little kind of anecdotes and stories. One of them being when J.M.W. Turner did some sketches of Dunblane Abbey. I think it was back in 1816, around about that time. John Ruskin was absolutely furious with Turner, and Ruskin had been an advocate for Turner until this point, and was furious with Turner about these sketches because Turner seemed to have left off all the lichens from the sketches of the Abbey, and Ruskin was very displeased about this. So I was able to share that little anecdote as well. Of course, it was important at some point to get onto the science of this and kind of start to talk about really what lichens were, as they weren't kind of very clear about that at the palace. They weren't quite sure what they actually were. They wondered whether they were just kind of plants, or small plants, something like that. So I thought a good place to start. And seeing as we are at the AGM, I thought a good place to start would be the British Lichen Society website. And so I shared this very simple definition of them being a symbiotic association with them. And so they had this kind of initial understanding of what they were, and kind of what was kind of interesting in a way is kind of, I sort of led the discussion into how kind of in a way, it's very similar to the relationship that the university that I'm at and Blenheim Palace kind of were sort of in a research relationship together. There's this kind of symbiosis kind of effect, and kind of just to kind of like, lead them into that sort of idea, if you like. But something else I wanted to do was to show that lichens are actually really quite complex things, also. So I shared with them a kind of a recent debate that's been going on in lichenology and was kind of played out in the New Phytologist about lichens being kind of ecosystems or complex ecosystems. And for someone like me, who works with kind of stone lichens and is particularly interested in the relationships between stone lichens and their substrate or the stone itself, this is a really interesting idea that, lichens are kind of in a way more than this symbiosis. They're also kind of these miniature ecosystems which incorporate lots of different kind of things, such as, just the fungi, the algae, the cyanobacteria, also other kind of like yeast. But also this is incorporating of the kind of those interactions with the substrate as well, with the stone itself, because you have to think about that when you're thinking about ecosystems. And so that's a really kind of useful way of seeing them. I think a really useful way of seeing them in terms of stone conservation, because it talks about a relationship between this kind of the living entity of the lichen, this complex ecosystem, and the stone itself. So it's kind of, I guess it kind of communicates and was communicating to Blenheim how lichens really are a relationship, not just internally between, fungi, cyanobacteria, algae, the rest of it, but also between their substrates, so the stone and the lichen. So it was kind of getting them to kind of understand that. That this really was a relationship we were talking about. Um, Following from that, I kind of wanted to communicate to the palace some of the uniqueness of lichens, so some of the kind of like incredibleness of lichens, and what's kind of really drawn me to them. And one of those things is their potential longevity. And so I kind of started talking to them about how we've discovered lichens in various kind of natural environments, which we believe to be very, very old. Through the use of lichenometry, we've discovered, discovered a part thallus or thalli in East Baffin Island on boulders there, which we believe to be around 9,500 years old. So, this is an incredibly long period of time. And then in more recent times, in northern Alaska, in Brooks Range, we've discovered a couple of other species which potentially could be anything up to 10, 11,500 years old, also dated with lichenometry. And that, is essentially the entire interglacial period. So, and this was really fascinating news to the people at the palace, and they were very absorbed in that. And I think got a very interesting question and from them, which was, does this kind of mean that there might be some really old lichens at the palace? And the answer to that is yes, yeah, absolutely. And having gone up on the roof of the palace, and there's a lot of structures up there which have remained untouched for the 300-year, kind of lifetime of the palace. There's a good chance that there will be lichens there which are hundreds of years old. And and this was news to them. This was a fascinating thing. And so kind of I'd started to build up kind of a bigger picture of what lichens were for the people at the palace there, and then I started to talk to them about how there are other really interesting things that we're starting to discover about lichens. So I started talking to them about how, there's a lot of research at the moment being carried out to look at kind of resilience and their physiology, and kind of, a lot of the research you'll be familiar with, which has kind of been looking at kind of Mars simulations and whether lichens would survive those sorts of environments. And the outcome of this research is very positive in the sense that lichens seem to have this incredible resilience, withstanding up to 12,000 times the dose of radiation human beings could, and those sort of things. And so it was just another opportunity to be able to kind of get them to see that these kind of things that were growing on their walls were indeed really truly fascinating. Whilst all this was going on, something very interesting happened at Stonehenge. There was the Just Stop Oil protest in June 2024, around this time of the summer solstice. And it was interesting for a number of reasons, really. First of all, publicly, there was suddenly a great deal of interest around lichens, and kind of, they're kind of pushed forward into the kind of public imagination, which was unusual because, my experience as someone who works with lichens, whenever I start to talk about my work to people, they kind of they usually look quite stunned, glazed, and kind of wondering what I'm talking about and what these things are. I'm not terribly convinced that people see lichens generally, or have. Or certainly weren't seeing them up until kind of this moment, and then suddenly they were very much sort of in the public imagination, which was interesting. But something else interesting about this is that the reaction to what happened at Stonehenge seemed to me to be something which kind of like really denoted this binary kind of experience of what stone and lichens are, and kind of a separation out of them. So in this context of Stonehenge, suddenly the lichens seemed to be talked about, and it was more of a concern about the lichens than the stone itself as to what had happened, which is tends to be the opposite when it comes to heritage conservation, cultural heritage conservation. There seems to be more concern about the stonework than what's actually growing on it, generally speaking. And obviously, in the past, that has quite often led to the removal of those things that are growing on the stonework, the monuments, the historic buildings, using, biocides, cleaning methods, various means. And so, something quite different was playing out here at Stonehenge, but it led to an interesting conversation around all this, and kind of what we value here when it comes to kind of historic monuments, as in Stonehenge, or historic buildings, as in Blenheim, kind of where the value lies. Does the value lie in stone, or does it lie, with what's growing on the stone? So that was a really, kind of interesting conversation we were able to have. The next thing really for me to do was to start sharing with them what was growing there, kind of what they had there. And so, I picked out 5 quite common lichens that were there and presented them in a meeting. And as you can see, these are the sort of things there. And as was pointed out in the meeting, they're different colours, different kind of similar sort of in shape there, but you can see them quite clearly. And so it was kind of at this point, I think I'd managed to start building up a clearer understanding kind of scientifically about what lichens were, and kind of how actually it's a kind of, the idea of what a lichen is something which is up for debate still. I also managed to kind of show that, they're very much in the consciousness of artists and alike. And we had this situation where kind of the public consciousness about lichens was seen to suddenly be kind of rising up suddenly. So that was kind of where we had got to. The next thing I wanted to do was to address their concerns around the deteriorative nature of lichens, or what they had heard or understood the deteriorative nature to be. And one afternoon when I was there, I took a stroll through the water garden at the back. And if you're familiar with it, it's where essentially there's fountains and various kind of features, sculptures, that sort of thing. And I discovered this wonderful spherical limestone sculpture. And what was so wonderful about it was that, to me, it was a lichen globe, and had all the different types of lichen, really, that you can you can see at the palace. And so here's kind of the surface of it here. And there were two particular lichens I was interested in, and two particular lichens I decided I would talk to the palace about. And the first one of those was a lichen called Verrucaria bordensis, which you'll be very familiar with, an endolithic lichen. And as I explained to them, this lichen submerges into the stone. So its kind of main body is actually within that stonework itself. It's submerged down. And the little pits you see are kind of where the fruiting bodies have died away and left the pits at the surface of the stonework. And when you just kind of rubbed your finger over that Verrucopodensis, it was a notable dip in the stone. And so I knew I was dealing with definitely dealing with Bordensis here. It's my experience of it, as I will talk about in a moment. And the other particular species I was interested here was Verruconia aggressans, an epilithic lichen, as you'll be aware, the black one there, and one which sits on the surface of the stone. So these are the ones that you generally see, kind of, very visible to the naked eye. And so I was able to make this distinction between these two species with the people at the palace. So I felt that was quite important to do in terms of kind of when you're thinking about biodeterioration and biological weathering. And so from that, I was able to talk to them a little bit more kind of about where you find these types of lichen, generally speaking. And if we start with Verrucoboldensis, kind of where I started with them, I explained that you can very much see them in the natural environment at Malham Cove, Yorkshire, but also at in the kind of in the historic environment too, in the cultural environment in Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, for example, where we are. And I'd seen a few of these species up on the roof on the sloping surfaces up there, and also they're on the kind of the paved section, and also on the kind of the spherical sculptures at the back. And I wanted to start off by talking about this particular species of lichen and my research into this particular species of lichen, because I wanted to deal with this issue about biodeterioration, which I think was very much at the forefront of their minds at the time. And I did this by kind of talking about some experimental work I'd done and showing some very simple images, actually. So I started off with a little bit of cut-off limestone that I had used, very similar limestone to what's at the palace. I'd used in an experiment previously, which was colonized by lichens at the surface. So the top image there, you can see the top is the top of the cut of limestone. And you can see that there's lichens there. It's colonized by lichens. And the bottom image shows that there's a central depression. That pencil across shows you very clearly there's a central depression there. And what you've got there in that middle bit is it's mainly colonized by Verrucoboldensis. So I showed them this. I took them out to the water garden. I got them to run their finger over the Verrucoboldensis. They noticed it sloped down. Bordensis, from my observations, appears to be a biodeteriorative lichen, certainly. So that was the first thing I shared with them. So I was dealing initially with their concerns and their anxieties and saying, okay, so what is there potentially a lichen here or lichens here which may be acting biodeterioratively? And this is certainly one that might well be. So that was that. Then I showed them, the next thing I showed them was a scanning electron micrograph of a cross section through that surface of limestone. So the top there is the surface coming down through the limestone itself. It's a 1 millimeter scale bar there. And you can see where how Verrucoboldensis is contributing to the weathering of that limestone. So there's the relic fruiting body or perithecia pits at the surface, those little black pits, and that obviously increases the porosity of the surface of the stone. There's some cracks formed by high fill penetration. There's also a dense network of hyphae in there as well. And all this contributes to the weathering of the stone, and also the release potentially of chemicals there. So all of this together is leading to an increased weathering of the stone through biological means, but also through an increase in solutional means because of the increase in porosity. So water being able to get into the limestone more. So I was able to share that with them. And I explained that kind of the idea that lichens are deteriorative or are known biological agents is something which has been around certainly since the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, and that's been very much prevalent in my field of geomorphology, and then kind of has kind of passed through into areas of kind of cultural heritage conservation. So it's been a kind of well known or well thought idea in that sphere. And something which has been quite prevalent in terms of forming attitudes towards biological organisms and things growing on stonework. So, so there was that side of things. However, I wanted to share with them a different story as well, which has come out of my research into lichens and into stone and rock. And that's a story about a little known Earth surface process called bioprotection. And I first came across this process when I was researching for my PhD. And I was reading one evening The Voyage of the Beagle, as you do, and I came across this quote from Charles Darwin within the Beagle, within the Beagle book, and he talks about how when he came to the southeast coast of Brazil and Pernambuco Harbour, when they docked there was a harbour wall there covered in sandstone harbour wall covered in kind of what he calls serpulae, various barnacles, things growing there. And he wondered and he thought and considered how these things may well be protecting that sandstone bar from change over time. And I think really what this was one of the first or earliest observations of this kind of little known Earth surface process called bioprotection. And that was something when I kind of first came across, really, I found such a fascinating idea. And I hadn't seen it really written about elsewhere. So I decided to look further. And when I did look further into the literature, I came across Archibald Geikie. I came across the textbook of geology. And in there, and again, this is the late 19th century. So this is a time where really kind of, in terms of lichens, things, organisms in the landscape, this idea of them being deteriorative in the landscape or on stone, etc., was very prevalent. Geikie even at the end of the 19th century was saying this, and I draw your attention to the last sentence here. A crust of lichens doubtless on the whole protects the rock underneath it from atmospheric agents. Now, that is a clearly stated observation of bioprotection. Okay. But again, this didn't kind of infiltrate or come through or filter through the common belief of kind of lichens and organisms being deteriorative within the landscape and weathering models. So the conversation I wanted to have with Blenheim was around this species Verrucarian aggressans and the work I've done on this species. So in relation to bioprotection, I spoke to them about Darwin, I spoke to them about Geikie, and then I spoke to them about this particular species. And I showed them these images again. And I said, well, if you look at the sides of these images, not the centre now where Verrucopodensis is dominant, if you look at the sides, you can see that there's different species there, there's quite clearly different species there. And in fact, what's there is mainly Verrucarian aggressans and some other small epilithic lichens, similar epilithic lichens as well. And you can see there that actually, there's a higher kind of elevation to the stone and far less weathering seems to have gone on there. Well, you can kind of explain this through this kind of what Geikie was talking about, this kind of protective nature, this barrier that these epilithic lichens, those lichens sitting on the surface, are kind of performing when it comes to in relation to other weathering agents and other forms. So what you've got here is this the scanning electron microscope image, which I shared with the past. I showed the surface here. Again, you've got the surface of the stone. The top there, on top there, that spongy thing is really the kind of, the thallus of Verrucarian aggressans. And it forms this protective barrier just there on the surface. Now, it doesn't mean that weathering doesn't take place. You can see a small rock fragment there in the thallus, small element of kind of limestone there. It's been plucked away. But when it comes to kind of protecting against wind and rain, it certainly does provide this protective layer. And I was able to talk to the palace about some of the research I've carried out since I did my PhD and kind of published research. And I talked about some experiments I've done whereby you can actually start to kind of draw up a conceptual model of how bioprotection will work. Now, in terms of Verrucarian aggressans, it's an interesting species because how Vericarian aggressors will behave very much depends on the climate regime of where you are. So I think it depends on kind of, the temperature and moisture regime of where you are. Because when you come to think of that kind of that covering of Vericarian aggressors, it's a black surface that has a particular albedo. So when it comes to environments where maybe there are higher temperature or kind of more dynamic temperature regimes or higher temperatures or higher ranges of temperature, it may be that the absorption of heat that takes place at that thallus because of its color may potentially contribute to increased insulation weathering. There may be an argument for that. But it depends where you are, and I think these next diagrams kind of show what I mean. So you've got a conceptual model there on the left of how bioprotection might work with the thallus there, sitting there on the surface, say Vericarian aggressors, and then protecting from rainfall, potentially wind as well, the action of wind. But we need to kind of bear in mind this albedo effect and kind of the potential increased warming with Vericarian aggressors and how that might play out. However, when we come to think of the situation of Blenheim and Blenheim Palace, this is located in an environment which is temperate. The temperatures don't reach incredibly high temperatures. They tend not to be huge ranges, what you might experience in other environments, kind of globally. And so, in fact, varicarian aggressors in a kind of, say, a wet, temperate environment, which you may kind of, potentially call where Blenheim is in Woodstock in Oxfordshire, is going to sit more in that kind of upper part of this diagram on the right, where we believe bioprotection would be taking place. Now, if you translate that to other epilithic lichens, say, and a lot of other epilithic lichens are not necessarily black or dark, they'll be lighter, white, yellows, they'll be more reflective. So the bioprotective effect of some other lichens, other epilithic lichens, may well be higher than that of Vericarian aggressors. So you can see here how the story isn't just one of biodeterioration when it comes to lichens. When it comes to epilithic lichens especially, it is one potentially of bioprotection. So that was something I was able to share with the panelists. I was also able to share another piece of research that I've done, where I've constructed a lichenscape, and I'm looking at the kind of what the combination of lichens means for solutional weathering of the surface of limestone. I was able to talk to them about that, and so how I'm trying to kind of decipher that complexity at the moment between epilithic and endolithic lichens, and what that, when they're in combination, what that means to kind of the weathering of the surface of limestone. And I hope to be publishing some results from that very soon. So I'd kind of dealt with looking at their concerns about biological weathering and lichens and stone decay, and sort of showed them the picture is actually more complex, and there's also a great potential for lichens being bioprotectors in the natural environment. The next part of my study really was to do a fuller scale survey of what was at the site, and I was able to do that. And so we surveyed, along with a colleague of mine, David Hill, former president of the British Lichen Society. David very kindly joined me, and we took a look at the lichens there on the northeast face, and also on the west face, and the north face, and also the southeast face. And we drew up a considerable list. We did this in a fairly short space of time. We weren't able to survey higher up. So, my estimations are that there will be at least twice or three times the amount of species than what we've kind of listed at this point. And one thing in particular we did find on the southeast face was a single individual Feospora parasitica, which is, as you'll be aware, is a very rare lichen, and there are very few kind of sightings or recordings of it, let's say, in the UK, probably between 50 and 60, I believe. So this was the first recording for Oxfordshire, and we were able to inform BLS about that, and also inform the Palace, and they're obviously incredibly excited about that. They hadn't realised that they had a rare lichen at the Palace, and so this was something which they were able then to reflect on in relation to biodiversity, and especially in relation to their status as being a UNESCO World Heritage Site. As part of that, status requires them to maintain and enhance the ecological value of the site, and knowing that you can then kind of bring in the lichens into kind of their thinking around this, and kind of that kind of status was something which was really important here, I think, in our conversations, and something they very much took on board. And so that was all very exciting. And here we have Feospora parasitical, which David marvelously photographed, and I was able to share these photos with them too. And it was really, again, to spark that wonder, that fascinating kind of how kind of the wonder of how beautiful lichens are, not just kind of like, to the naked eye, but also when you really start to look at them very up close under a microscope, when you're kind of carrying out taxonomy. So that was another opportunity to do that, and to kind of broaden their view of what of the lichens that they had at the colonizing the palace. So just to recap, I mean, at this point, I was able to discuss, kind of what lichens were, not just scientifically, but in poetry and art, and then kind of what kind of relationships they had with stonework, and this idea that lichens were simply deteriorative to stone isn't true. We don't believe that anymore. We believe that there are bioprotective effects of lichens. I was able to share that with them, and also that they were dealing with a considerable biodiversity of lichens at the site, and not just that, but a rare species of lichen, which is obviously very exciting. I was also able to talk to them about the importance of lichens in ecosystems, and so for the ecosystems, the wider ecosystem presence present at the palace. So all these very positive things. And the next thing I wanted to talk to them about was to get them to think really quite carefully about the aesthetics of the palace itself, and in relation to the lichens. So I took them to this sculpture here, and just to go on the left, just for a discussion, and just to talk to them and get them to try and imagine what that sculpture might look like if you strip the lichens off it. If you did what Ruskin accused Turner of doing. If you take all those lichens away, how different it would look. The kind of image here is almost anthropomorphic. It's kind of like, you've got the cap on top, and the bare face, and the kind of cloak. This is all created by the lichens picking out certain kind of architectural features, if you like, of the sculpture, those microenvironments, and creating a kind of really kind of diverse view, really playing with the tone and texture and color of the sculpture. And if those lichens were not there, it would look very different indeed. But it was pointed out to me that there are times where stone has to be replaced, and on the image with the image on the right, and it was put to me that potentially this is a bit of an eyesore when this is the case, when you've still got lichens and various aspects, kind of various parts of weathering taking place around all that, or have taken place and very much present around that restored stone. You're left with something that looks like this. And as I explained to them, there's a number of ways you can think about this. Ultimately in time, that stone will look like the stuff around it. Say, for example, you were to clean the stone around that stone there, so that it will all look the same. Actually what will happen is eventually those lichens will come back and all return together. So, you're going to have lichens eventually anyway, unless you're going to be spending vast amounts of money on continually cleaning the walls. So there's a lot to think about there. There's obviously the economic cost of doing that, but I got them to reflect on what I'd said to them about essentially about kind of the cultural element of these things, the poetry, the art, but also thinking about the biodiversity of the lichens here at the site, the potentially bioprotective nature of many of these species, and you weigh that up against kind of the kind of also and also incorporate or weigh that up against kind of how much you might be spending on cleaning costs, etc., the rest of it, and how often you might have to do that. There's things to think about here. And I like to think that I've managed to convince them that actually situations like this, this is a dynamic situation, and that's going to change. And in time, this will all again look very similar as that stone there gets colonized. So another thing to do here is I just wanted to show you that it wasn't just me who thought this stuff. Who better to talk to than artists when it comes to thinking about aesthetics and how things look. So I was able to share, the thoughts of Leonardo da Vinci, who essentially, back in Da Vinci's time, they very much kind of saw lichens or talked about them in terms of stains, and so Da Vinci saw entire landscapes in lichens and kind of saw them as these incredibly kind of diverse forms and incredibly kind of aesthetically interesting. And this was very much the case for Henry Moore as well, the famous sculptor, and in a way was kind of he was quoting Leonardo there in saying in the lichen lines on a wall, an artist should be able to discover a whole landscape. So, kind of seeing these whole landscapes, you know, in terms of the lichens on landscapes is really contributing to that kind of geodiversity, if you like, that kind of real diverse image that that filters through our eyes and goes into our brains and kind of forms in historic buildings. And I got them to reflect on this as we walked around. And so, the lichens were doing so much to the aesthetic of the building, kind of reacting to the architecture, whether it's even Varicaleodensis, which is on the kind of the sloping surfaces, we're kind of creating these depths and kind of changing the tone, how the light plays upon that surface. So you've got some whiter lichens, maybe Dorina, or kind of some Aspercilia, Caloplaca ticolita on kind of ledges, reflecting that light off. It kind of almost illuminates the wall, where the light kind of rebounds off and illuminates up and kind of creates these kind of light textures. And you might get kind of Caloplaca flavescens doing something rather marvelous as forming this kind of line of symmetry on the right hand side there between where there's a join in the stone there, and there's obviously an increase in moisture levels where that's where the join is taking place, and kind of all these things create this incredibly diverse image of the stonework and of the palace. And it just became a really fruitful conversation in terms of kind of discussing what the palace should really look like. And this is, an important conversation that we might have with all kind of, those custodians of historic buildings about, what should that historic site look like? Should it look like as it first did, that pristine building? Or should we accept that kind of what a historic building is then what a ruin is something which, is something which is dynamic, which changes over time, and also represents that kind of biological life that we find growing on it too, and kind of perhaps thinking that and understanding that biological life actually becomes part of that structure, part of that stone. Those relationships we've talked about are so very close, and are inevitable in time. And so that's something that we should certainly be considering. So in the end, the palace asked me to produce a report for them, which I did, and things have gone very well. And I think our conversations, and they were very much a two-way conversation, and the palace were wonderful in being receptive to what we had to say about this and what I had to say about this. And I think it's fair to say that they had started to see the lichens very much in a new light, in a broader light, in a more developed light. And so they took the report and they actually kind of decided to publish it on the website. So it is very much available on the website. If you Google Our Living Stone Blenheim Palace, it will come up for you, and you can read a little bit more about what I did during my site visits. Also in that report is some more information about the cultural heritage of lichens, which I've not gone into in too much detail here, kind of about lichens, the dyeing industry, dyeing of clothes, kind of how important they've been for that in the UK and Europe and elsewhere, and various other things. So you'll be able to kind of learn all about that in the report as well. And finally, just to say, I recently kind of wrote an article which was partly inspired by my time working at Blenheim on this project, but also in kind of in reflection of things of the events of Stonehenge, but also my work generally, and that's very much available at the moment. That was published last year in the Conversation, the journal, and you can you can find that online if you Google my name, Nicholas Carter, the Conversation. It will come up, and in that I very much talk about kind of like how lichens are kind of really important in terms of reconnecting us, and kind of like understanding lichens is important in terms of reconnecting us with the natural world around us, and kind of how they can give us a very different perspective on the natural world around us, and especially stone, and kind of help us also to start seeing stone differently. And that really is the theme of a forthcoming book that I've got coming out in 2028 with Penguin called Living Stone. So hopefully in time you'll be able to see more in that. Well, thank you once again. A huge thanks to the BLS for inviting me along to give this lecture. It's a real delight, and I hope that for all of you who weren't able to join us, that this has been informative and interesting to listen to. Okay, thanks. Bye.